Thank you everybody for coming to the latest iteration of this CPC webinar series as it is. We're delighted to have you along. And today we're very pleased to be able to introduce our own Professor Brienna Perelli-Harris. Brienna is a world-leading expert in family demography, and I'm sure many of you know her series of really groundbreaking publications in the area of comparative study of families and changing family structures and fertility. But today she's going to be displaying another string to her bow in talking about a quite different but equally important topic. So her title of her talk is Understanding Low Subjective Wellbeing Among Internally Displaced Persons in Ukraine, Current Deprivation, Loss of Status and Trauma. So I will hand over to Brienna.
So as Jason mentioned, I have a completely different topic today than most of you would expect from me. Most of you know me as somebody who studies family change and cohabitation and marriage and fertility. But I've actually had a really long-standing interest in Ukraine. I was in the US Peace Corps and lived there from 1997 to 1999. And my PhD was on fertility in Ukraine. In the early 2000s, Ukraine had the lowest fertility rate in the world. And so I was quite interested in this country, and it is very understudied in general. There's a lack of data. And so recently I've been interested in revisiting the country because of this lack of data. We just don't know what's going on. And then unfortunately in 2014, war broke out in the country, and that made it in some ways even a more interesting case study. So I started talking around to my colleagues, including Ted Gerber at the University of Wisconsin, who had continued to work on Russia and Ukraine. And he had been working with Jane Zavisky at the University of Arizona to conduct a survey in Ukraine and Russia and several other post-Soviet countries. And their interest was on housing and how internally displaced people had been dealing with housing. They had not considered subjective well-being at all. So I convinced them to work on this paper on subjective well-being of internally displaced people. And we brought on board our colleague Natalia Lepchuk from the Tukha Institute for Demography and Social Studies. So first, I'm going to give you a bit of background. As I mentioned, rather unexpectedly, there was this conflict which broke out in 2014. When I lived there in the late 90s, nobody would have expected that there would have been a civil war, but that is basically what happened. And it has been quite devastating for the country, unfortunately. It started in 2013, late 2013, when there were mass protests in Euromaidan, and that was also a violent conflict that led to about 100 deaths. And that led to the ouster of President Yanukovych. And in retaliation, Putin annexed Crimea in February 2014. That was very shocking and sudden. But it then led to even more protests in a particular region of Ukraine called Donbass. It's the far east region, and it's next to Russia. There were two oblasts or regions called Donetsk and Luhansk, and there were protests in these various areas, and very quickly it led to armed conflict. And Russian-backed separatists took control of Donbass in 2014, which was also very unexpected, but because Russia provided much of the arms and soldiers and even military commanders to some extent, the separatists, the Russian separatists were able to take control of this area, which again was shocking to Ukraine. So this map shows the region which is controlled by separatists, these two countries, two states, more or less. This was a mining region, a lot of heavy industry and coal. It had provided a large part of Ukraine's GDP, I'm going to say a quarter or so of the GDP, and yet the place was still had relatively low standard of living. From a fertility standpoint, it always had very low fertility. The fertility rates never really recovered, although we don't know for sure because of lack of data. But to this day, this region is still controlled by separatists. The people living there call it the Donetsk-Luhansk regions. It's very uncertain exactly who is controlling it, how it's being controlled. The Ukrainians call it a non-governmental controlled area. That's officially what it's called externally, but it really is a no man's land. I mean, it isn't recognized by any organizations, and it is unclear exactly what's going on there. And it's impossible for me to go to, for Westerners to go to. So this conflict led to a huge humanitarian crisis with 1.7 million internally displaced persons. About nearly 1 million stayed in the separatist regions or went to Russia. But this is a very large displacement. It's the largest group of IDPs in Europe, and I think that it's often forgotten because they were internally displaced, they didn't flee, they weren't refugees. IDPs are often less visible globally, and they are not studied nearly as much, partially because there is no official recognition of the moving across borders. And they stay in their host countries, obviously, which in some ways could mean that they have an easier time assimilating, especially because they, in the case of Ukraine, they more or less share the same language with the people in the eastern part of Ukraine. So eastern Ukraine speaks Russian, while the western part speaks Ukrainian. Most of the IDPs settled very close to to the Donbass, to the area of conflict. Some went further afield to Kyiv or Lviv or even abroad, but many of them stayed in the same regions, and they were able to use their Russian, and they speak Ukrainian, but they prefer, their home language tends to be Russian, and they have more or less the same ethnicity. So the situation in Ukraine with respect to ethnicity is quite mixed. It's not obvious. Many people identify as both Ukrainian and Russian. When I was there, it really didn't seem like there was much ethnic conflict because of being Russian or Ukrainian. So again, this is why this conflict is very surprising, and most likely due to Russia's political power grab. But in any case, so these IDPs settled in the certain locations, and they, despite the fact that they could potentially assimilate, they did experience loss, severe loss. They lost economic resources, so they lost their jobs, they lost income, wages, and they lost housing. And that was one of the major issues, which I will talk about more, because many people had to leave their homes and resettle. In Ukraine, the resettlement primarily occurred within the communities. They didn't want to have special IDP camps, and sometimes they would build new dormitories or some sort of temporary accommodation, but they were trying to integrate the people into the local population, but the government itself did not do a very good job. And many people were unable to rent. They couldn't afford a rental property. So housing has been one of the issues which has been most difficult for Ukrainian IDPs. And of course, IDPs lose their social networks, their friendship networks, the people that they can rely on in order to cope with a difficult situation. And many of them are exposed to violence and trauma. Now, one issue, and I think that this is probably the case in a lot of the IDP literature, or it could be the case, is that people don't always migrate because they directly experience violence or the threat to family members. In this case, the IDPs were not leaving because for an ethnic or religious reason. They weren't persecuted, but they might have left because they no longer had a job and it was impossible to feed their families. So there are different reasons why these IDPs fled, but I wouldn't say that they are economic migrants because the situation in this region was so dire. They are internally displaced persons. So in this paper, we're interested in subjective well-being. And one of the main questions in the subjective well-being literature is to what extent people adapt to their situation, and if after a negative event, their subjective well-being returns back to baseline happiness. Now, very rarely have there been studies of refugees or IDPs that look at this question, but there have been many studies that look at, say, bereavement and widowhood, which find that there's a very slow adaptation in subjective well-being. There's a literature within the economic literature that looks at job loss or unemployment, which can produce long-term scarring. There have been mixed results for natural disasters. Some studies, say of Hurricane Katrina, have found short-term declines in subjective well-being, but returns to baseline relatively quickly. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of heterogeneity in who is being impacted and how they would respond to it. So in terms of natural disasters, of course, people with lower incomes and lower education might have a harder time drawing on resources to be able to return to their previous levels of happiness. So the refugee literature has examined psychological distress. There's a large body of literature that looks at mental well-being, especially from a psychological perspective. In Ukraine, there are studies that show that IDPs, many IDPs experience PTSD and psychological distress in general. But there have been very few studies that have tried to examine why subjective well-being has declined or is lower than the local population, which is what we'll be focusing on, and to what extent this subjective well-being is due to a set of different factors. So that is what we examine in this paper. We look at the gap in subjective well-being between IDPs and locals in Ukraine, asking, do IDPs have the same subjective well-being as the local people in resettlement communities? And this is really the best type of research design that you can think of, because we are using a local people as a counterfactual to think about what would have happened if these people hadn't had to move. Now, in an ideal situation, we would have measured subjective well-being before displacement and after displacement, but that is really difficult in countries that experience war and conflict, because often those are low-income countries with a lack of data. In the case of Ukraine, there has been very few studies over time that have been able to look at Ukrainian IDPs. The last household survey in Ukraine was in the early 2000s. The census was in 2001. So there's no baseline data where we could attempt to find these displaced people and then track them and see what their subjective well-being was like post-displacement. So our research design is ideal for trying to understand what would have happened. But it's really important to keep in mind that the local population also faced a lot of stressors related to the conflict on the borders and a strain on resources due to the large number of resettled IDPs. This country was at war, and so people were very worried about the conflict escalating beyond this contact line. And so many of the communities where the IDPs settled were unsettled themselves, and that they didn't know what was going to happen. So we don't compare the local population with their prior subjective well-being either, and we don't compare them with other countries. It is a specific way of examining the problem. But it is important to keep in mind that the locals themselves might have been under pressure. Now we start the analysis by just trying to make sure that these groups compositionally are similar. So we control for gender, education, age, location, and language. And some of these are known to be important factors for subjective well-being. So after having controlled for these basic conditions, we are really interested in current conditions and then subsequently the loss in conditions. So locals and IDPs may differ in their subjective well-being because they differ along a number of factors. First of all, family and social support. It might be that that IDPs have fewer people that they can rely on. Second would be economic status, unemployment, and the standard of living. And then finally, housing conditions, which differ between the local population and the IDP population. So these are some of the main factors that we look at first. And then we are interested in the loss that IDPs would have experienced. First of all, relative to their previous conditions, because relative loss, relative deprivation to one's own past could explain some of this unhappiness. We look at occupational earnings to see to what extent the IDPs had a loss in income relative to what they would have had in 2013. Then loss of home ownership and decent quality housing. And this picture is rather stark of people who definitely lost their homes, but many people had to flee and leave their homes anyhow. If they did go back to them, they'd often been looted. And for everybody, it was impossible to sell their homes, get that equity, and then reinvest it elsewhere, so into a new home. And they wouldn't have had the down payment or the ability to buy a new home, so they would have lost their home ownership. And then we know also that the quality of the new homes that they would have had, the housing, was much worse. So again, they're thinking about what they had in this particular part of the analysis. And then finally, friendship networks. So comparing to what the friendship networks were in 2013, have they become better or worse? Then, as I mentioned before, the IDPs did flee for a number of reasons. We asked them what were the top 2 reasons why they left. And some of them said it was only due to reasons of violence, fear, and threats. Some of them said violence and trauma and one other reason, for example, economic, family, or other reasons. So if they left because they lost their job or because a family member had left. So we divide the IDPs into these 3 different groups because we think that the reason for leaving is extremely important for understanding how their subjective well-being compares to the local population. So the data that we use is the Comparative Housing Experiences and Societal Stability Survey that was conducted in 2018. I forgot to write that down, by my colleagues. And it was conducted in these locations that you can see on the map. The gray area is the non-governmental controlled area. The red line is this line of contact, which is very difficult to cross. And then you can see that there are certain regions which accepted far more IDPs than others. So these circles with a cross, these are the 12 urban settlements where the data was collected. By design, my colleagues collected data from 1,600 IDPs and 1,600 locals. This is not a representative sample. We don't know how we would possibly get a representative sample for several reasons. One is that there is no sampling frame in Ukraine. The last census was in 2001. 2, IDPs can be hard to find, especially if you're not in an area where they're concentrated. And my colleagues wanted to get a range of reports from across the country, not just in the heavily concentrated regions of IDPs, with IDPs. So they did a random walk to find IDPs, and it was in the attempt to find a rare population. So we couldn't, unfortunately, we couldn't apply weights because there's no sampling framework. But nonetheless, the data is comparable to other surveys by IOM and other types of surveys which have looked at various factors like unemployment. So the response weight was relatively low, but then it's low in all countries these days. So our analysis itself is relatively simple. We just use OLS. Because our dependent variable is to what extent are you satisfied with your life on the whole, and there are 5 categories. We did look at ordinal models, which showed similar results, but for simplicity, we just show the OLS results. The main explanatory variable is the IDP status and combined with the primary reason for moving. So as I mentioned, there are these 2 main reasons among 9 options. Those people who only experienced violence or only left because of violence checked something like the fear of military conflict, fear of local authorities, threat of violence, home was destroyed, and then the violence reasons plus 1 other. The economic reasons included work prospects, education prospects, or then to join or reunite with family or friends. And then some people gave no reason at all. And so the reference group in all of the analyses is the local population. So these are the basic variables that we look at with respect to current status, marital status, living arrangements, the number of non-family members who the respondent could ask for help. And then with respect to economic status, we have a set of variables: employment status, total household income, durable goods. Housing status includes home ownership, housing space per capita, having a room of one's own, and housing quality. And then we are interested in this loss or change variable. So people had to reflect upon what their situation was in December 2013 before the conflict started. And they reflected on their social network with this self-reported change in circle of friends. And then economic status would have been self-reported change in durable goods. So did you have a list of items, a washing machine, a TV, so on and so forth? Was it higher then or higher now, lower now? And then we constructed a downward earnings mobility measure, which was based on what they reported their occupation was in 2013. And then we specifically ask about loss of home ownership, loss of private room, and absolute change in housing amenities. So here are some descriptive statistics, and you can see first that the local population has a mean subjective well-being that's higher than the other IDP groups, with the IDPs who are displaced only due to violence having a much lower mean subjective well-being. In terms of age, education, marital status, number of children, and their basic living arrangements, there are very few differences. And this is very important to how we conceptualize this analytical problem, because we are positing that the IDPs are very similar to the local population in the pre-conflict era. So we would expect that their age, their education, and everything that they had was similar. Then they experienced the treatment of displacement, and then their conditions changed. So it's good from an analytical perspective that they were quite similar with respect to these variables. But when you start to look at the variables that we expect to change, you see some dramatic differences. Not so much in terms, well, here is the number of close friends one could turn to for support. This isn't so different. You can see that more than half of the locals, about 70% of the locals, said that they had 2 or more friends they could turn to for support. And it's about 53% for the IDPs displaced due only to violence. So they're relatively similar with current friendship networks or these close friends they could rely on for support. Economic status is also not too different. This is good news because it looks like many of the IDPs are employed. maybe they're underemployed. We don't capture that in this particular measure, but we would in terms of income. But for the most part, yes, the local population is slightly more employed, but not dramatically so. But when you start to look at home ownership, this is where some of the really dramatic differences emerge. So 90% of the local population in our sample reported that they own their own home, or somebody in their household owned their home. So a family member owned the home. But for IDPs, it's the vast majority do not own their own home. So again, these are some of the very strong differences, stark differences between these two groups. And this reflects the same measure with respect to loss in home ownership. So 96% of the locals did not lose their homes, but about 3/4 of the IDPs lost their home. And around 1/4 of IDPs lost having a room of their own, which indicates that they're often in overcrowded conditions, even 5 years later, 4 or 5 years later. And then the change in circle of friends is also quite different between the two groups. So the local population said about 72% reported no change in their friendship networks, while about 66% of those who were displaced due to only violence said that their situation was worse. So there are certain aspects which really distinguish the IDPs from the local population, but there are still differences based on how much violence the IDPs experienced. Okay, so now onto the OLS results. So here I am showing just our main category of interest, which is the IDP status based on whether they experienced violence, they experienced both violence and economic and family reasons, or they were displaced due only to economic family reasons or didn't respond. And that's with respect to the local population, in reference to the local population. Down here, I put in the different variables that we include in the models subsequently. And I just put some stars down here as to whether or not each one of these is associated with subjective well-being. So we see that males have higher subjective well-being than females. It's older, there's also an age effect, higher education. Those people in Kyiv actually had lower subjective well-being than other regions. So, but if I go to this first column, which looks at controls, we can see a very large gap between all of the IDPs and the local population when we only include these controls. But the gap is smallest among those who left for economic or family reasons or other reasons. In this next column, we include family and social support network, and this reduces the gap somewhat, but not a lot. That includes the marital status, whether or not they're divorced, children, living arrangements, and this important variable of the number of people one can ask for help. So people who can rely on more than 2 non-family members for help are significantly there's a much stronger association between this variable and subjective well-being. So this set of variables reduces the gap somewhat. The economic status reduces the gap much, much more. And you can see that for those displaced only to economic or family reasons, the gap disappears completely. So let's look again at what these are. There's employment status, unemployed, household income, and durable goods scale. So as has been found in the subjective well-being literature, one's standard of living is strongly associated with one's subjective well-being. And this set of measures is very important for reducing these differentials. But nonetheless, they still persist for those people who report any sort of violence as a reason for leaving. Then we look at controls plus housing status, and we see that the gap is reduced, but not quite as much as for the economic status variables. Strangely enough, home ownership is not associated with subjective well-being in these models, but we would expect that if we looked only at IDPs, we would see an effect. But having your own room, housing amenities, and housing comfort are all associated with subjective well-being. And the gap is eliminated for those people who did not report violence as one of their main reasons. And when we put all of the conditions together, these current conditions, we see that the gap is substantially reduced, but not eliminated for those who are displaced due to only violence. But we see quite a substantial reduction due to these different factors, characteristics about the displacement that are helping to explain this gap. And it's completely eliminated for those who did not report violence as one of their main reasons for leaving. So now let's look at loss. And again, this is the idea that people have lost something relative to what they had previously. When we include these loss measures, we can see that they do reduce this gap substantially, but not completely. So first, circle of friends, better or worse. And so those people who said that their change in social support was worse would have had substantially lower subjective well-being. And when we include this factor in the model, the difference or this gap for those people who report one violence reason for leaving, that gap is then explained. But if we look at current conditions plus change in economic status, it doesn't reduce the difference for those people who reported one reason for violence and one economic reason. And with respect to the change in economic housing, the change in occupational earnings is substantially negatively related to subjective well-being, suggesting that it's quite an important factor in explaining this gap. But finally, when we include all of both the current conditions and the loss conditions, we see that these two categories of IDPs become very similar, indistinguishable from the local population. But those who experience trauma are still strongly different. The association is very strong, and that all of these variables do not explain this gap. So we see that without controlling for anything, there is a significant gap in the subjective well-being between IDPs and locals. Compositional factors don't explain the gap, but current support networks, employment status, and homeownership each reduce the gap. But the reasons for leaving really make a difference. And I think that this is quite important for this concept of subjective well-being. It's not always just being forced to move for an economic or losing one's job, or other types of family reasons or education reasons. Then if you leave because of these reasons, then you're not affected in the long term. But if you leave because your home has been destroyed, you have been forced to leave because of fear and violence, then there's a persistent effect of this event on subjective well-being. So controlling for current adverse conditions and loss relative to past conditions explains about half the gap in life satisfaction between IDPs and locals who fled only due to violence. So there's still there's something unmeasured that we couldn't capture in this comprehensive set of variables. We didn't include mental distress. We didn't include a lot of very specific measures, for example, whether or not they actually had a close relative pass away or die from the violence. That was measured, but it was relatively rare, despite it having even though it would have had a strong effect. We didn't capture that many people in the data who had lost a family member. But there was some other type of effect that was going on that we just simply couldn't measure. So the trauma and violence of displacement continues to have a long-term impact. So from a policy standpoint, we would recommend that those people who did say that they had experienced trauma to receive further trauma counseling and support. Now, I'd like to point out quickly before taking questions that the situation hasn't gone away. While some IDPs are integrating into society, some have returned, many have returned. So there are fewer who are now living in the government-controlled areas. Many have gone back because they have their homes there, they had jobs there, and they want to try it and see what the situation is like there. Maybe they simply couldn't afford to live and to pay rent in the government-controlled area, and they missed their home. So many of them did leave. Some are in limbo. They're waiting to find out what happens. Is the separatist region going to improve? It's going to have an official status. So they feel lost and don't really know what to happen. There does continue to be a low-level conflict that continues on the border. Casualties are reported regularly, and Russia is sometimes a threat, as we saw last year. So these non-governmental control areas are also an unknown entity. We know that there are difficulties with public services, health systems, transport, documents, just a whole litany of problems. And what I think is important to remember is that those people who didn't leave may have subjective well-being similar to those people who did leave. We know that from focus groups, which I'll tell you about in a minute, that many of the people who couldn't leave were often pensioners, or they had care responsibilities for parents. They couldn't afford to. They didn't have the means to be able to leave. They didn't think that they had any jobs or any prospects abroad. So this area has been left behind. It has very few prospects for the future. It's really, it's stagnating. It used to be extremely it was thriving. I mean, it's amazing because in 2012, Donetsk hosted the European football champions, and there was this huge, beautiful airport built in 2012, and 2 years later it was completely destroyed. Well, now all of the prospects in this region have completely gone away, and it's rather hopeless. And over the past year and a half, the COVID restrictions have completely sealed off this area, and people have not been able to leave to visit relatives or to, in some cases, get benefits and pensions. So it's a very interesting area, and I've actually had the opportunity to conduct focus group research there. Last July, I worked with my colleagues to conduct online focus group discussions. We conducted 16 focus groups in small and large cities with both men and women. There were also locals, and then we were able to conduct focus groups with people in this NGCA, which were really fascinating because we could get insights into how they were living, and we would not have been able to go there, not just because of COVID, but because we aren't able to travel into that region. And our connections, our survey agency also couldn't go into this region, but they had enough contacts to be able to conduct these focus groups. And so we had Zoom focus groups. And they talked about the problems during last year, the experiences during conflict, and I was particularly interested in depopulation and low fertility. But that is the subject of another talk, and so I want to go back to the subjective well-being aspect of it, and I welcome your questions on the topic.